All right, good morning and welcome to today's Applied CAx webinar on NX CAD. Today's webinar is tips for improving design workflow, just basically tips and tricks within the NX CAD environment that could improve your overall and general workflow. My name is Devin Croswell, and I am an NX applications engineer at Applied CAx, and I've been with Applied CAx and Sherpa Design, the mechanical engineering design firm side of things, for over 15 years now, and I've been using NX the whole time, off and on with a couple other CAD packages, Creo, and as well as SolidWorks. So I kind of know some of the back and forth between those that come from those backgrounds. And I've been giving trainings in various topics on NX for the past year pretty steadily, and we'll be continuing to do so as well as future NX CAD webinars on various topics. I think the next one we might plan to do pretty soon is surfacing in NX, so keep a lookout for that. But let's get right to it. Number one, as far as tips for the NX workflow, is once I've got my NX environment started, my NX tool started, one of the first things I'm going to want to do is take a look at the environment and see how I can customize it. One of the reasons I want to customize my NX environment is because NX allows for a lot of customization, and it allows me to change the user interface, streamline how I like to work, change various settings based on what I'm used to. And so if I jump into NX here, this is what the NX view or window looks like, surrounded by various toolbars populated with various tools and commands. Up here at the top, we have our ribbon toolbar. This is kind of the main button selecting toolbar. NX is presenting me with some basic tabs with different buttons on them, and they're all kind of grouped together in certain categories and presented in a suggested workflow. And I can turn these different tabs on and off by right-clicking up in the ribbon toolbar area. I can check off all the stuff I don't want to see, turn on all the things I want to see, turn on Materials Engineering tab. I can take a look at the tools that are available there. Go back to my Home tab. The Home tab is a dynamic toolbar, and what that means is that as I jump from different applications within NX, the buttons that are being presented, the tools, the commands that are being presented to me change based on my application. So right now, at the very top here, it might be a little hard for you to see, but it says NX Modeling. I'm in the NX Modeling application, so I've got access to what NX is giving me as far as all the various modeling tools. And so my Home tab reflects that. If I jump into the sheet metal application, my Home tab would change and present me with the workflow of creating a sheet metal part, the various tools used for that. So we don't have to use the out-of-the-box setup here. There are some additional out-of-the-box roles on the resource bar. This is the bar. The resource bar is the one that's on the left side. It's got various tabs as well. Mostly we're going to look at Part Navigator, which holds the features that we create. Constraint Navigator, if we're adding components to our part, making it an assembly, our Constraint Navigator will contain the constraints we're using. And then the Assembly Navigator will show me the various components that I'm adding, if that's what I'm doing with my current part. But on the Roles tab, we've got two folders where we have Content and Presentation. The presentation part of the role allows you to adjust for the type of equipment that you have. Most of the time, this is just going to be staying on default, but if you have a 4K and you like what NX does when you switch to a 4K role, then you can keep that Otherwise, if you have touch panel monitor or touch tablet, you can switch to that and it'll allow you to adjust based on the size of what your equipment is, and kind of squish things around so that you can see things easier on that type of equipment. But where we're going to be customizing things more is in the content side. And out of the box, we've got two main CAD roles. We have the Essentials role and we have the Advanced role. And my suggestion when you start using NX, if you don't feel like customizing the environment right away, my suggestion is to apply the Advanced role. And what that's going to do is present you with more options as far as tools. So if I go up to my Home tab and I go to this More pull down, I'm going to see more tools under these groups than I would in my Essentials. The Essentials role is just there to maybe prevent you from being overwhelmed with all the information that NX has. Another thing that turning on the Advanced role will help with, and this comes up a lot with those getting into NX, is that when you jump into a tool and that dialog box comes up and you need to start creating, there's a little button in the upper left called Dialog Options. And when you apply the Advanced role, it will automatically turn on the More options for most of these tools, if not all. If I click on this here, I can see I can switch back and forth between More and Less. So if I change this to Less on the fly, I can see a bunch of sections where I could enter in different details about the blending operation that I'm adding right now disappeared. And so if you ever jump into a tool that you've used before and it doesn't seem like it had all the options it used to, check the More and Less options. So now I've got variable radius, corner setback, stop short of corner, lots of additional options added. And this is similar for a lot of other tools as well. So Advanced role, if you're starting out of the box and you just kind of want to get modeling. But if you do want to customize your environment, there are, in my eyes, three main areas of customization within NX CAD. We have customer defaults, preferences, and customize. Now, customer defaults, you can get to that area by going to File, Utilities, Customer Defaults, and that'll bring up the dialog box for that. And what these are settings that are default for the customer. So whatever the initial settings for when you installed NX, this is sort of your base package of settings. This is how everything is as default. And so you can go through here and change a lot of these, depending on the company, some of these might be locked down, but if you have a lot of access or if you have your own NX seat, you can get into, I think it's been said, somewhere between 30 and 40,000 different settings you can come in and modify if you really wanted to. You can see in the box here, they're divided up into larger sections based somewhat around applications like Gateway, sort of your starting application, modeling, sketch, curves, analysis, things like that. And then when I click on those larger sections, I get subsections that I can click through. And then in those subsections, I have multiple tabs to cycle through. And so you can see there's so many settings in here. And in general, you're probably not going to mess with too many of those, but occasionally things will come up when you're like, oh, I wish I didn't have to keep changing this over and over again. You can go to your customer defaults, set that, and then going forward when you're working in NX, that's how NX will treat your environment. One of the ones that I like to point out inside of customer defaults is the mouse scroll direction. And that's in the Gateway section under View Operations. And then on the tab of the same name here, we have a pull down where we can switch between scrolling forward to zoom in versus scrolling backward to zoom in. And I kind of like this setting because you start to think to yourself, am I model centric in my thinking or am I camera centric in my thinking? So am I the stationary thing and the model part is moving around me and I'm pushing and pulling it with my hands, or is the part stationary and I'm flying around it like a camera and applying the different operations? So I kind of like pointing that one out because it's always interesting to see who goes which way there. And then once I apply the customer default that I want, I can hit OK or apply. I'm not going to do that here now, but it'll give you a little warning saying this actually won't be set till the next time you start NX. And so you want to make sure to file exit out of NX after making changes to customer defaults. And then the next time you boot up the NX, those defaults should be the way you want them. The second area of customization is preferences. For that, we can go to File, Preferences, and then we get a list of different sections. Some of them are application-centric, others are just sort of general user interface, object, things like that. And what preferences are doing are basically overlaying those defaults with settings that you want to manipulate for a certain period of time or for a certain project. And so you change the way something is being treated in the sketching environment for a part, but you don't do that in customer defaults. You're doing it in preferences. And so while you're working on that project and those parts, the way you have those preferences set will hold. But if you come back the next day or the next week and you start NX and you start a brand new part, those preferences in the sketch environment may or may not be there. Some of them seem to hold when I'm not expecting it, but most of the time, the customer defaults are the ones that stick. Preferences are the ones that stick for a little while. Two areas that I like to point out as far as the environment itself. So we have user interface and selection. So if I go to File, Preferences, User Interface, brings up that dialog box, and we've got some sections here we can investigate. One of them being layout. And the thing on layout that I like to mess with is where my queue or status line position is. Right now I have it at the bottom. It's this little line way down here. Sometimes I like to move that sort of more up to the upper middle, right above my viewing window. So if I do that and hit apply, my queue line then moves to above my viewing window. And what that's going to do, the queue line, is you can see it's kind of prompting you for what's happening. It's telling you a little bit about what's happening. It's prompting you to maybe complete the next operation. It might tell you what you're hovering over, what you have selected. It's basically your status line, your queue line. It's giving you a little clue about your environment and what you're doing inside of it. If we go back to user interface preferences, another one I'll point out is theme. Right now we're in the light theme, which apparently is recommended. I think this has been recommended for a little while now. The version that I have, which is NX, I think I'm all the way up to 1969 now. We have a dark theme. I can't remember when exactly that started, but I think it was somewhere around 1899 or 1926 as part of the continuous release package. I don't need to get into that today, but I can change my theme. So a lot of engineers have been waiting for the dark theme for a while, and so this is what that looks like. And so I can change the way my NX presents itself just visually, really quickly and easily. Another thing I'll mention as far as visualization is now that I have this dark theme, my background's popping a little bit too bright, right? So I can just simply right-click in the background and I get my menus, my right-click menu. Lower middle here, we have a quick change of background color, so I can change that to dark if I so choose. But I'm going to go ahead and undo that now, so I'm used to working in the light theme. And then we'll take a look at some selection preferences. So I'm going back to the File Preferences pull down Selections area. Here, it's giving me some different options with how my mouse and cursor interact with the environment. The multi-gesture, I can change how my mouse highlights as it's selecting or hovering over different things. And then one I like to point out is the quick pick dialog box, quick pick selection here. Right now, under the quick pick option, I have this to appear on delay, so quick pick on delay. So with that still checked, what that means is as I hover over an aspect of my part, I'm going to get these 3 dots, these ellipses after my cursor here. And the next selection I make gives me a list that pops up of all the things, all the objects that are nearby that I might be trying to select. And so NX is trying to make it a little easier for me to select. If I have a lot of stuff in my screen, it's really cluttered, I can't quite get what I'm trying to get, or maybe my priority of selection isn't set to what I'm trying to pick, and so I keep grabbing a face instead of an edge. So you can use this quick pick to specifically grab what you're trying to grab. But for example, I don't particularly like the fact that as I pause just long enough, my next selection is going to throw up that menu every time. And so if I go back to my preferences for selection, I can uncheck that box, click OK. And now when I hover over my part, I could hover here forever. I'm not going to get an ellipsis, and that's fine with me. However, I do still have access to the quick pick dialog box. All I have to do is hold down my mouse button 1 for a brief second and then let go, and I get that back in my screen. And I can then select specifically what I'm trying to grab. And so I like this a little bit better. So I always like pointing that one out in case it bothers other people. So that's preferences, and you can get into more specific areas for modeling and sketch, depending, like I said, on what's needed for a specific project for a while, or maybe you're trying out a new setting because it seemed like it worked better this way, and so you're setting that in your preferences and kind of using it for a bit. But the third area of customization is simply called customize, and you can get to this environment via the file pull down as well at the lower right here, or the hotkey Control 1. But most of the time, I'm right-clicking on my ribbon toolbar where I can then uncheck my tabs. At the very bottom, I've got the customize environment that I can jump into. And when I click on that, my screen changes a little bit, and that's because I'm now in the customization environment, the customize environment. Everything I click on in here, it's not going to jump me into the tools. I'm dragging and turning things on and off and hiding things and moving things. And so this is where I really get to change the kind of tools that I see when I want to see them. You'll notice that up where my tabs are added, I have this little plus sign now, so I can create my own tab, which looks like I've done here, all hands tools. But I can create my own tabs, call it my name, and add whatever cool tools I want on there, so I don't have to go looking for them. In the customized dialog box here, we've got a couple of tabs, one of them being the commands tab. And here I can search for whatever it is I'm looking for. Just start typing something in. It's pretty intuitive as well. And so you'll get a large list of different things that I want to see. Let's see through. Let's go curve. Add curve analysis. So let's say, I'm looking for a certain tool and it's always in a spot where it's inconvenient for me to try and find that all the time. I realize I can use the command finder to look for it outside of this environment and use it there. But maybe I want it on a specific toolbar. In fact, I want it on the home toolbar. And so I can just click and grab this from the list and drag it up to my toolbar. And now I've got curve analysis as part of my home tab. And so when I jump into modeling, I've got curve analysis as part of my home tab. And so I can make all kinds of changes like that. I have border bars around my viewing and working window. I can add buttons there as well. Another thing I can do is on the last tab in this area, I can change the size of my icons or my menus. You'll notice I've already changed mine from normal to large up here on the ribbon toolbar, and I like to do that when I'm presenting. I'm hoping it makes it a little easier to see the commands, but I can also change the different border bars, shortcut menus, the tool menus themselves. I can make those larger so that when they come up larger, things like that. When I'm done moving commands around, and then actually one thing I'll mention is that you saw me add one. I can simply take this away by clicking, dragging into my working window, and that disappears. So I can move them on and off at will there. But once I'm done doing that, all I have to do is close out of this. It'll keep all those changes that you've made and jump you back into your application, your modeling application. And once you've done all these customized items, you changed some settings, you've moved some menus around and changed the size of a button, you're probably going to want to save that. Because if I go over to my roles now and I apply my advanced role, it's going to get rid of what I just did. It's going to kind of clear that away and make that my new default now, or my I guess my current, my using user file. It'll set that to the advanced style and kind of clear any modifications that I made. And so what I want to make sure and do is with the modifications made, I want to create a new role. And I'm going to switch to the next page here. So number 2, creating the role. So an NX role is, as we saw, a modified collection of commands and options, and I can activate this at any time. I can jump back and forth between advanced and essentials, and NX will move that stuff around for me. I already mentioned that the NX advanced role is my suggested out-of-the-box setting there. And once we've made those changes, we're going to want to save it, and we can do that by going back to NX, and on the roles tab with my changes created, if I right click in this open area here, at the top of my menu, there's new user role, and that will take me into the role properties for this new user role. I can name it. You can see here I can add a picture to it. So instead of looking like a little folder or something, it looks like whatever I want it to look like. I can add a description. I can make it available as both content and presentation, which is probably going to be most common. And then I can check on the list of applications, which are already going to be pre-checked. So every application I may jump into, I will have access to this role. And once I do that, I can click OK. And now a new user folder has been added to my roles area, and my role is sitting here. And so if I go back into my customize environment and add that curve analysis again, I can right click on my role that I've created. So I don't have to wait till all the changes are done. I can create the role, make some changes, save the role, and now I can say go back to advanced, and that button disappears. I can go back to my user, my role, and that button comes back. And then let's say you want to, or someone's created a role and you want to share that role. I think you can dig down into the installation files and find that stuff, but you can also save it out, and you can do that inside of preferences. For user interface, there is a roles section here. And with the current active role on, I can click the new role button. It'll allow me to save out that role file. And then once someone has access to that, this is where you would come to then load that role so that you have access to it in your NX environment. So once we've customized our environment, and saved it as a role that we can get back to. The next main thing we want to make sure and do is get into our assembly load options. So assembly load options is a really important aspect of NX. Working with NX and not really understanding assembly load options can really make it troublesome. These options allow me to deal with really, really large assemblies. It also dictates how everything, as far as files and assemblies, how all that stuff is being treated. And once I've set all my assembly load options, I can save that file out as well. And we have access to assembly load options via the file pull down, assembly load options on the right side towards the top. When I jump into this dialog box here, what NX is having me do is basically tell it how to load parts. And so this first part version area here, there's a pull down so that I can tell NX where to look. When I open an assembly file, where's NX going to look for those components? Is it going to look for the last place everything was saved? And so the as saved version of the assembly. If I change this from folder, it's only going to look in the same folder that the assembly file itself I'm opening is contained in. So if that's where all the components happen to be, then great. But if not, it's not going to see any of those. And then from search folders, this is where I can specify certain paths and folders for NX to look in. And you'll notice that the one that I have on here already, if you can see that, it's got 3 dots there, the ellipsis. And when you add that to a folder address under the from search folders, you're telling NX to look in this top level folder that's listed here, but also look in anything that's a subfolder. And so using these different options here can really help get those settings for when you're working either on your desktop or even more so in like a group of network folders with a team, and someone moves a folder or accidentally deletes something and NX can't find it, or they moved it over here. And so if you have your assembly load options set a certain way, it will help alleviate those kinds of issues. So after you tell NX where to look, you're then telling it what to load, whether you want all the components to be loaded that are inside the assembly, or maybe you don't want any of them. You just want the assembly file itself and the structure loaded up, but none of the components. You can have a little bit of both with as saved, so some of them are loaded, some of them aren't, however that assembly file was last saved. And then if you've added component groups, it will prompt you to specify which group of components you want loaded. Most of the time, this is just going to be loading all components. That's kind of suggested. There are instances where you want to change that to structure only, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. Under the option in scope, we're telling it how much of those components we're going to load. So we told it where to look, what to load. Now we're telling it how much. So we've got fully load all the components, and that'll load all the file data, display the exact geometry, and just everything is contained in there. It's going to load everything. Partially load. This is probably the most common setting where it loads just enough so that I can see what it is and interact with it. And when I start interacting with it, either I start working on it in the context of the assembly or I open it in a new window, it will fully load it at that time. And then we have some combinations here where we're loading the part data fully, but we're only having it display a faceted version of the geometry. And then we have a partially loaded version of that with lightweight, as well as minimally load. And minimally load is pretty cool. I've never really had to use it for any reason because I don't work with assemblies where I would need to utilize minimally load. But basically, if you're opening up an entire plane or something and it always takes forever, even with partially load lightweight display, it still just takes forever. Minimally load will help with that. You can start actually working on the part as it's loading up, spinning it around and looking at it. You don't have to wait for everything. It'll do some of that stuff in the background. So if you have really, really large assemblies, that is helpful. Load inner part data, you can check this on and off so that if you have links between parts or via expressions or objects, geometry, you can check that on, and as NX loads your assembly, it will, and the components, it will look for that data and update them. If you have that checked off, then you can go in and update that stuff manually. A few more things on assembly load options and we'll move on. There's a few things in load behavior where allow replacement and generate missing part family members. They do something similar where basically, I guess the instance I'll use here is fasteners, where I've created in an assembly my own fastener so I could check something fit-wise, and someone from the team comes through and cleans up the assembly and adds their own version of that via a part library of some kind. And so even though it's the same name, it's a different NX part, but you can tell NX to allow that kind of replacement to happen. And then generate missing part family members. So part family members, there's a parent file and there's many versions of some thing that's really similar to the file that's the parent. And as you create those part family members, it will create versions of that part. And sometimes those don't get saved fully, or maybe they're moved, but NX can still see the parent file. And so it can generate that automatically via that parent file, even if the actual NX file for the part family member is missing. And then we can also specify reference set on load. Most of the times it's just going to be as saved, that's the default, but we can specify that each component that gets loaded has a certain reference set. And then after going through all those options, you're of course going to want to save everything that you've done here. And so you can save that as your default load options. And you can also save out to a file, which can then be loaded by someone else or your home computer, things like that, via the assembly load options dialog box here. So I'm going to show from folder, let's do structure only. So I'll show you what structure only looks like. This is the one where I'm going to open up an assembly file and it's not going to open any of the components. It's going to be able to see them because I'm telling NX where they are, but I've also told NX not to load them. So I'm going to have that set, click OK. Then I can go to File Open or Control O and find my assembly. And when I open that part, I don't see anything. And so to investigate that, I can go to my navigator tabs here on my part navigator. Because this is an assembly file, I don't have any features added here. All I have added is components. So I'm going to go to my assembly navigator and I can see the blank unloaded components on my assembly navigator. As I hover over this, I get little bounding boxes telling me about how big something is, what the name of it is, and where it is. And one of the reasons I might want to use this is, like I said, if I have a giant assembly, a plane or something, and I am just responsible for one aspect of this, and I hate how I have to load everything just to make a little change, and I just need to see the parts that are around it. So you can load the structure only, find that part that you're interested in, and just work on that part. Or let's say you need a couple of the parts around it, but the assembly navigator is a little confusing. I can't quite tell which parts I want. I don't remember the name. If I right click on that part that's shown now or loaded, one of the options in my right click menu here is open by proximity. And so now I can jump into an area where I can tell NX that because I've loaded this as structure only and turned one of these on, there's a range of components I want NX to open around the part I'm interested in. And so I can take a look at a few of the options in here. I have a range slider, so obviously the bigger my box, the more components that are going to be loaded. Anything that touches that box will be loaded. I can also specify a size. So if I have a bunch of components or circuit boards or something, and I don't want any of that stuff loaded, I can change the size of the component that gets loaded and ignore a lot of that stuff. And once I have my box set, I can hit preview, and then I can see which parts and what the name is of the parts that are going to be loaded. If that looks good, I can click OK, and then it'll load those parts and only those parts. So it's a nice little open by proximity to get to an area of your assembly, if it's really large. And that's what assembly load options is really trying to do, is help you deal with those very large assemblies. But it comes into play with any part that you have to open. Number 4, pretty basic one, just have a plan of attack. So when you're designing a part or an assembly, you want to know everything that's going into what you're designing. So, it's probably a rare case where you're just like, I'm making something, and you just start doodling away. And so you're going to take all that information and make any needed adjustments. Maybe, which features you end up using kind of depends on, the way the thing needs to look or what it ends up interacting with inside of an assembly. So just being aware of those factors will contribute to downstream changes and make it a little bit easier to deal with. It'll make your part much more robust when you have a plan in place. And part of that plan can include whether or not you're going to reuse information when you're starting a new part. And obviously we want to emphasize, if you have the ability to reuse something, reuse some information, reuse an entire part, please do so. It makes everything much quicker. Hopefully, if you design the part, then you designed it well. Hopefully, whoever designed it really well, and so you can just jump off from their part, do a save as, make a few modifications, and you're well on your way. If you're taking advantage of that existing knowledge, it can just really speed up the design process. Another thing that kind of plays into reuse is being able to use a tool called Wave Geometry Linker, or a version of it called Product Interface, where you're bringing in outside aspects from other parts into your part, either to start the design or maybe even partway through as some sort of interaction that you need to make adjustments for. And so you can reuse an aspect of another component via that inner part linking. And then, as always, when you're creating actual features, you want to make sure to pattern as much of it as seems possible, or use as much symmetry as you can, and it speeds the process up a lot and keeps your part a little more robust than it otherwise might be. However, if you don't have the ability to reuse very much and you are just starting from scratch, then you're going to want to start with a sketch. Sketching in NX is a very powerful tool. It heavily influences all the features that follow, especially if you set it up correctly. So start with a sketch whenever you can. A robust sketch that drives the design can really save you a headache downstream. Some basic tips when creating sketches: constrain the sketch as much as you can. A fully constrained sketch won't do something you're not expecting when other things change. Use geometric or relational constraints over just dimensional values for a more robust sketch feature. And that kind of plays into the same thing as fully constraining the feature, where the relational constraints can adjust and adapt to changes to things much more easily than a locked-in value. Use symmetry and patterns within the sketch environment as well. It's not just outside of the environment. Try to minimize the fillets and rounds that you add, and just create those as blends towards the end of the part. This makes your life a lot easier as you're making changes and adding additional features if you haven't added those blend faces to the part yet. And if you are creating a pretty complicated sketch, try and do a little bit at a time and then constrain a little bit at a time. And so instead of just jumping in and drawing exactly what the thing looks like and then trying to figure out how to lock it down, it might be a little easier to sort of start in a quarter panel of it, create that, and then see, take a step back and see, okay, what's this side going to look like? Can I just mirror this over and stuff like that? So take your time if you know you have a really complicated sketch. Sometimes it is as simple as just drawing in a little profile and locking it down, but sometimes your sketches can be a little more complicated than that. And then for sketches that are created after you already have some feature or modeling features within the part, you want to try and make sure you're avoiding any relationship to littler detail features or features that could change really easily. So like you don't want to dimension to the edge of a blend and then that blend gets a little bit bigger because of something that happened with the part, or it looks better this way, and now your sketch is starting to shift and you might not even be aware of it, and so you wouldn't even catch that problem right away. And so you want to just make sure to orient your sketches relative to, I guess, the part itself and not always to other features within the part. Sometimes you do want that relationship so that if something changes, that sketch does change. So in that case, feel free. And then one thing I'll mention with sketches is that you can start with a sketch and then jump into a tool and making that sketch sort of an external feature on the feature tree. You can also jump into a tool, and a lot of them will have the ability to jump into the sketching environment and have that as an embedded feature. Once you have some sketching down, you're going to be moving on to modeling features and using more of an intent with these features based on the various options that you have inside the tools. And I'll show you here in a second what I mean by that, but there are always different options as far as, do I want this extrude to go all the way to the end, or do I want it to go to this specific value? And so depending on how you choose those options, changes downstream to your part may affect how that extrude is then treated. Also pay close attention to selection intent when picking objects based on your selection intent and what you're telling NX is actually being selected may or may not have different results. I'm going to switch to this and I'll show you a little bit about how this was created so we can see what's happening here. On my feature tree, or my part navigator, the feature tree here, I've got a datum coordinate system that's hidden. You can see the little eyeball next to all these features that I can turn on and off. It's showing and hiding those features. Every part that I start will have a coordinate system added to it if it's part of the modeling template, and most of them have that. And here I've created a sketch on one of the origin planes. And you can see that the tool that I use to draw on this sketch is going to be this profile tool, and that allows me to continuously draw in my sketch. It's going to allow me to snap certain constraints and allow those to form, and then I can escape out of that tool and lay down some actual dimensions or additional constraints. Go ahead and delete that. But in the environment, you get this dynamic home tab, and you have curve creation and then curve editing and different operations. And here, one of the things I've utilized is the symmetry that I have in this bracket. And so I've created my initial sketch around the origin point so that I can then use this Z-axis and the make symmetric constraint to essentially mirror over those curves. So I can draw in one side, fully dimension it, draw on the other side, and then lock it to the other fully dimensioned side. Another way I could have done this is use the mirror curve operation that would simply just mirror those curves over and slap on a mirror curve constraint so that changes to one side will be reflected in the other. So I'm trying to make use of that symmetry to speed up my design process. Once I have what I want sketched, I can click Finished. And actually, you'll notice in my queue line, my status line, that it's telling me the sketch is fully constrained. And so it will let me know if that sketch is constrained. It'll let me know how many constraints I might need. But if I jump out of there and start an extrude feature, which is on the Home tab here, I already have it created. But I'm using that sketch as my section curve, and then picking the direction and creating my first solid aspect of the geometry for this bracket. And this is where selection intent is going to come into play. Right now, I have feature curves. In the window here, there's pull downs that become active and are shown and hidden. Right now, I'm using the feature curve selection to select all the curves within that feature, which is a sketch. So if I leave my selection intent as the feature curve, I'm going to cancel out of that so it keeps that selected. If I go back to my sketch, and I could have actually jumped into my sketch from the extrude dialog box here. So if I jump into that sketch that I'm using, and I just throw in an errant curve, click Finish, this is going to cause some problems, because what NX is now seeing is that I've added an additional curve to this feature, and that's what I'm telling it to use to create this extruded body here. And so now it's saying, wait a second, there's a weird intersection here. I can't create the thing they're telling me to create. So it's giving me an alert there. So I can cancel out of that. Let's say I need that line. What I can do is change my selection intent and then shift select my previous selection. And now instead of the sketch curves, the feature itself, I'm just adding single curves. So I'm just going around adding those single curves that happen to be in a sketch, but they're the same curves I was using previously. They're just selected in a different way. So now I can click OK. And if I go into my sketch that I'm using and throw that line back in, NX ignores that now. Maybe it's just a reference curve. Who cares? You're not telling me to use that as part of the extruded feature. So something to keep in mind as you're working with various tools, selection intent becomes a really important aspect of the design process. Just to quickly continue through some of this, adding in another extrude on the face of this solid, allowing it to automatically unite to what's already there. In this instance, I am adding some rounds here to my profile, and maybe I need sketch control over this for whatever reason, but I don't want to add it as a blend. It needs to be a sketch for some reason. I can do that. This extrude I'm using to complete the rest of the horizontal base part of this feature. And one of the things that I'm doing in this extruded feature is that I'm changing the way the limits are being selected. So before I was just picking values at start and end. And so most of the time it was just a 0, coming from the sketch plane, and then an end value. But in this instance, what I'm actually doing is relating the end value to another aspect of the geometry that I already have. So what I'm doing here is I'm tying my end value of this extrusion to this bottom surface or this undersurface of the initial solid body. And so what that allows me to do is keep it tied to, say, if I make a change to the thickness of this plate, the additional extruded feature, because it's tied to that bottom face, wherever that is, that's the end limit. And so it now follows. And then I'm adding some additional blends, holes, bosses, more holes, more blends. But you'll notice that I'm only adding it to one side, and that is intentional, as I'm once again trying to use the symmetrical aspect of my part and a feature or a tool called mirror feature. And I can grab all those features and mirror them across the origin center there. And add in a rib. And I'm done. Once I finish, say, I've got my construction geometry, my datum planes, my sketches, I've got my feature modeling, my solid bodies. I want to start adding a little more detail. I have some detail on there, but one of the things I might want to start considering is what my blend strategy is. Having a blend strategy is always good. You don't want to just all of a sudden throw in a blend and then ignore that area and come back to it later and try and add more blends. You know, that blend may have stuff on top of it now, and so you can't change the size of it, or you can't add another one to go along with it. And so one of the suggested strategies for the way I've been working in NX is that you want to try and hold off on your blends as long as possible, as many of them as possible, as long as possible. And then once you do that, you want to start with the largest blends you can, and then move kind of down to the smaller. This will allow all the blends to work. If you start adding the small blends and then you got these large blends coming across the top of others, it may not work so well. The other suggestion is to always try and start with edge blend. It's one of the more powerful tools in NX. And you can usually get what you want by using edge blend, or maybe you're using multiple edge blends. So maybe you couldn't get this all in one shot, and so you have to separate those features on the feature tree. If you can't quite get what you want with the edge blend tool, you can start using some of the other blending tools. The next best one would be the face blend tool. And then, as always, if you can't get any blends to work, then you're going to end up creating some surfaces and patching that stuff in there. I'm going to head to NX now, and we'll take a quick look at some blending options. This is just a block with some features on it that will allow me to throw some interesting blends here. Up on my home tab, I've got the edge blend tool. You'll notice that it's a pull down, and under the pull down, it also contains face blend. And so I've got my two main blend tools right here on the home tab. If I jump into my edge blend tool, one aspect that I want to point out about dialog boxes when I jump into a tool, jump into an operation, right at the top, there's a little button for reset. And so if you jump into a tool that usually uses a lot of different options, you may want to consider resetting that dialog box every time you start a new blend, unless you're adding the same blend over and over again, because what NX likes to do is remember those settings from the last time you used the tool. It tries to do its best in that. And so I may have some weird stop short of corner thing added that I had forgotten about, and everything starts failing and I don't realize it right away. So reset. And then what we'll look at here, I'm going to change the size of my blend. But based on some of the options and how you apply the blends, it can give you a different look on your part. So for example, if I add in a fillet here, you can see that the tail of this is pointing up. If I do it the other way, the tail is pointing down. So you're going to get different looks. Let's say you don't want either one of those. So if you investigate some of the options under settings here, there's one called patch mixed convexity corner, and this will allow me to fix that interaction by simply checking it on and selecting both of those edges. So it all depends on the look you're trying to go for. Flip this guy over here. Another thing I can do is if I have a large interaction, let's say I've got these two blends coming together, obviously that looks pretty ugly. I don't want that, but I also don't want to reduce the size. It needs to be this radius. And so I have to deal with this in some manner. Under the overflow overlap options, I've got some preference. pull down options here that I can select. One of them being trim blends. That looks a lot better. It's kind of allowing me to deal with it separately. Let's see what these other options do. So this one is actually just cutting all that stuff out when they start interacting with each other. And so maybe that ends up working better. Whatever I go in there and do after I apply these separated blends ends up working better in that area than if I were to allow it to overlap and then try and fix it. So many options in NX. Exploring those options is always a great idea. And we're running out of time a little bit, but I'll go to my PowerPoint. Communicate the design. So after we've customized our environment, our workflow is great. We're really efficient using NX. We got our sketches, our solid geometry, our detailed features, our blends. Now we need to get this design out there. Understanding how you're going to communicate that early on in the process can really help your design workflow. So whether you're going to have to deal with certain drafting standards, or if you can just use the 3D model and add some model-based definition or PMI, a well-defined drafting process can make a really large difference in your workflow. And then lastly, education is key, as it is with any subject. NX CAD is no different. NX is moving and changing very quickly, especially recently with continuous release, and trying to keep track of all that information as well as just keep up with the new and available tools can be time consuming and hard, but if you are able to do that and you're sharing that information, it can be extremely valuable to you and your coworkers. And simply just being aware of a tool or an option that exists that you didn't know of before can dramatically change the design approach for creating a part. And so just being aware of all that can really help your overall design workflow. So education becoming really important. Things like training and things like these webinars